The morning light came through the stained glass like honey, warm and slow. It always does at St. Mary's, greens and ambers laying across the aisle where my father used to sit, where Edward and I exchanged vows when I was still 26 and bold. I can still feel the lilt of the organ in my chest, the roughness of the hymn book edges under my thumbs. Those Sundays were my small altar of steadiness after he died. The worn prayer book in my lap, the familiar creak of the third pew, the smell of sanctuary candles and old wood. When Father Thomas announced the repairs, his voice felt like a cold hand on my shoulder. $60,000, he said, and I watched the numbers hang in the air above the congregation like a distant bell. He put his palms together afterward, fingers worrying at the frayed ribbon of his Bible. You could hear the pipes in the heating system cough in the back. The words "close the doors" landed heavier than any sermon he'd ever given. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed with Edward's sweater folded on a chair, the house quiet except for the fridge and the hiss of the radiator. I turned over the savings ledger I'd kept tucked in a drawer. A lifetime of shifts as a nurse, overtime, the small thrift of a tablespoon of sugar here and a rerouted grocery trip there. The numbers were ordinary and stubborn and mine. The thought of St. Mary's dark and empty, our baptisms, funerals, my husband's vigil, it felt like slamming a hand in a door I couldn't open again. The next morning I went to the parish with the leather bag Edward gave me on our 20th anniversary. The bag smells faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. I still keep the receipt Edward wrote inside. Father Thomas met me by the sacristy, his glasses perched on the chain, the lines at his eyes deeper than usual. The light in the church had the cool, dusty smell of old books and polish. I set the envelope on the table between us and felt my heart stutter. "I want to help," I said. My voice surprised me, steady like when I gave a shot at 3 in the morning and the child's mother was too frightened to breathe. "But please, promise me no one will know it's from me." He looked at me the way he looks at everyone who comes to him with a hard thing, half pastor, half brother. "Eleanor, you shouldn't hide this," he began. I put my hand over his, the skin on my knuckles thin, the veins mapping like tiny blue rivers. "Because I don't need the altar to thank me, Father. I need the roof." My fingers closed once on the envelope. The words were small, but they landed with weight. He nodded. There was a whisper of relief like a door latched properly, and then the work began. For weeks the church smelled of sawdust and fresh paint. Men clattered on scaffolding. The echo of hammers was a stubborn drum. New lights bloomed above the altar. The organ pipes were tuned, the hymnals rebound. They polished the pews until my reflection looked back at me in a shine that frightened me a little. I'd walk in on a weekday and stand at the back, my hand on the pew's edge. The same wood my mother's fingers had traced when she whispered prayers for a son at war. I kept my ring on always. It's a small worn band scratched at the edge, my anchor. I suppose it became my symbol, the quiet thing I carried when everything else felt like a performance. Linda was excited. She called me one afternoon, voice bright, the sound of tulle and laughter in the background. "Mom, St. Mary's is perfect for June," she said. "It's so lovely with the renovations." Her excitement was a small sun I didn't dare shade. But then the sun tilted. When she invited me to the fitting, the bridal shop smelled of starch and floral spray. The lace of her gown breathed like new skin, soft and nerve-tinged. She hugged me first, hands at my shoulders, then pulled away with that nervous little smile I know so well. "Mom," she began, and the way she said it made the bones in my chest go small. "James's mother. She's a traditionalist. She thinks it'll be better if you sit in the last row. It's just—" her fingers fluttered, and they looked like they always do when she's trying to soften something she doesn't want to hurt. "She says because you'll be alone. It's more proper." Her eyes darted to mine and I watched her choose her silence like a costume. The words hung. I felt the room tilt. The dress swished and the clerk hummed nervously at a mannequin. I smoothed my skirt with both hands, the fabric cool and plain against my knees. If that's what they want, I said. My voice was small then even. I'll sit where you ask. It was a kindness and a wound at once. I told myself I would do anything for the shape of Linda's happiness. Still, I felt the old familiar tightening across my ribs, a kind of hollowness shaped like a pew. I started to practice smiling. On the day, the church smelled of lilies and coffee, the air crisp with June. The staff had polished the aisle until it glowed. The lights overhead were the very ones I'd paid for, softening every face to a kind of merciful glow. I walked in and the congregation seemed like a current around me. The family of the groom took the front rows, their jewels catching the light like small storms. I sat in the last pew, the wood cool under my palm. My prayer book lay on my knees, corners softened from years of prayers. My fingers looped through the ring on my left hand until it ached. I could hear the organist warming, a low hum that felt like a held breath. Linda was at the altar, small and luminous, and for a moment, just a moment, I let myself think maybe this was enough. Then the door at the back opened, and footsteps crossed the threshold. The bishop's gaze cut across the nave and found mine. My heart hammered like a runaway drum when he leaned over and whispered into the priest's ear. Time seemed to stop. One by one, everyone in the congregation turned and looked at me. My dears, thank you so much for sitting with me today. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber is a breath of life. Our little goal is 1,000. If this story moves you, please click subscribe, and if you don't mind, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. It means the world. The bishop's eyes found mine and something inside me clenched. But before that breathless moment in the nave, I keep returning to the small, ordinary mornings that made me who I am. The quiet before a life makes noise. A few days earlier, I woke to the kettle shrilling in the kitchen and the thin June light slipping through the gingham curtain. It painted the table in a line of pale gold. The coffee smelled like a promise, bitter and warm, and I stood with my hand on the counter, feeling the heat seep through my palms. Edward's sweater was folded on the chair across from me, the scent of his tobacco faint in the weave. I traced the worn seam with a fingertip, and it was as if time softened against my skin. I am 64 now. People say that like it's a small thing, but the number carries a gravity, years of night shifts, of holding shaky hands, of wiping someone else's tears until yours were the only ones left. For 38 years I wore the cap of a nurse with some stubborn pride. Even now, long retired, I move with that same steadiness. Shoulders back, hands calm, voice low. The parish knows me for handing out rolls at potlucks, for tending the bereavement calls, for the little bowl of coins I'd drop at the altar when I could. The church has always been my compass. The place where vows began, where babies were blessed, where Edward's hand lay cold in mine as people whispered prayers and lit candles. That morning I opened my ledger, the one tucked under a loose floorboard in the bedroom, the one Edward once teased me about. I ran my finger over the columns, the tiny neat numbers like stitches. It's remarkable how ordinary numbers can hold a life. Overtime, extra shifts, skipped vacations, small thrift. The thought of St. Mary's dark and empty made the numbers feel suddenly enormous. I could hear the memory of Father Thomas's voice in the sanctuary, $60,000, and the way the congregation had fallen a little quieter afterward, like a hymn losing its chorus. Outside, the church bell began to toll noon. The sound cut across the neighborhood, clear metal against the wide sky. It always steadied me. I used to think the bell called everyone home. That day it felt like a summons I couldn't ignore. Before I left, I slipped into my blue cotton dress, the one that sits comfortably at my knees. I pinned the small pearl necklace at my throat. The pearls are cool against my skin, and they always remind me of my mother. How she would smooth the same strand and say, "Carry yourself like you mean to stay." My wedding band is still there on my left hand, a thin circle of silver dulled by years. I've worn it every day since Edward died 5 winters ago. It's my quiet rebellion against forgetting. On the way to St. Mary's, the streets smelled faintly of cut grass and engine oil. I walked with Father Thomas stood near the sacristy, his glasses on a chain, the lines at his eyes softening when he saw me. We have always had the kind of friendship that doesn't demand confession. He knows the shape of my grief and I know the rhythm of his. The parishioners came and went through the side door for coffee hour. Mrs. Klein dropped a plate of scones beside the altar with a flourish and a whisper about the bake sale. Everyone moves with the ease of small-town faith. The same faces at funerals, baptisms, pancake breakfasts. It's a comfort that can also bruise. When Father Thomas told me about the repairs, the words landed like cold water. 60,000, he said, and his voice was a thin thread. I watched him rub that frayed ribbon on his Bible until it looked like it might come apart. The smell in the church that day was of old books and polish, of beeswax and dust. There was a draft through the stained glass window that lifted the edges of the hymnals on the pews. I thought of every baptismal candle I'd held, of the funeral where the choir sang Edward's name, of Linda's small hands curled in mine at a Christmas pageant. I thought too of the empty bench. The ledger felt heavier in my back, the numbers suddenly taking on a weight I could place like a brick under a door. I told Father Thomas the first wanted to help. I told him I wanted no thanks. My hands were steady when I closed the envelope. My throat felt oddly dry, like the moment before giving an injection. He tried to persuade me otherwise. He always does. But I saw in his eyes a relief so pure it made me ache. That afternoon the scaffolding moved in, and the church smelled of sawdust and wet paint. The men worked with a steady rhythm. I watched from the doorway, my palm resting on the pew where Edward's imprint lived. I pressed my ring into the wood as if to mark it. No, not mine to mark. It was the place where gifts could be given without applause. Some things are care, plain and unfussy. Some things are love that does not require an audience. And so I made the choice I made. To mend the roof, to keep the lights on, to keep the house of our small faith warm when winter came. I did it because I could, and because some doors ought never to close on memories. I did it because I wanted St. Mary's to be there the next time Linda needed a place to stand, and because some of us know how to give without announcing it. Later, as the organ warmed up and the pews began to fill, I sat in the last row and smoothed my skirt. I folded my hands over my prayer book, feeling the rough edges of the pages under my fingertips. The light moved across the aisle, and the bell tolled once more. The sacristy was smaller than I remembered. The light coming through the little side window thin and dusted with whatever prayers had been said in the last 50 years. Father Thomas pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and folded his hands on the table between us. His Bible lay open, the pages softened by so many thumbs. The smell of beeswax and old polish wrapped around us like a shawl. "Eleanor," he said, and the way he said my name made my stomach hollow. "You shouldn't hide this." My hand was already on the leather bag Edward gave me. The strap had a familiar softness where it rubbed my shoulder. Inside, the envelope felt absurdly solid, as if the sums it carried were small bricks. I could hear the faint scrape of a chair in the nave, the distant murmur of parishioners setting out coffee. Outside, life carried on in the ordinary way churches do. People folding bulletins, a child laughing down the corridor. It made my choice feel both monumental and almost silly. "I don't want a plaque, Father." My voice came out quieter than I planned. The words tasted like pennies. "I don't want the notice in the bulletin. I just want the roof fixed." He watched me a long time like he was trying to find which part of me was really there: wife, mother, nurse, the woman who showed up at every funeral and fed grief with cornbread. His hands were large, kind hands. He reached across and touched the back of mine. The skin on my knuckles was thin. "Why not?" he asked. "This parish, St. Mary's, needs to know how many hands lift it. They need to see who keeps it going. People will give when they see example." I swallowed. My throat felt tight, as if someone had wrapped it in cotton. I could feel the band of my wedding ring against the inside of my finger. An old steady pressure. Edward would have grimaced at the thought of a brass plaque with my name. He never wanted fuss. He would have liked the roof mended quietly, with tea afterward, maybe 2 cookies and a half-hearted laugh. He'd have said, "We did the right thing," and gone back to his paper. "But what about the sermons that get twisted?" I said. "What about people who only give to be noticed? I want them to keep the doors open because they believe in them, because they remember their own baptisms, not because they will be thanked from a pulpit." Father Thomas sighed. There was a softness in it, and then gently he pushed. "Eleanor, you have given your life to caring. The parish knows that. They know your hands. Let them honor you. Let this be an encouragement. You shouldn't have to hide." His words were not a rebuke. They were an invitation. The trouble was, I knew what hiding did for me. It let me give without having to explain why. It let me protect the private corner of my heart where Edward's laugh still lived. It let me feed people with nothing expected in return. I felt the old nurse's reflex, the one that bandages without asking for thanks. That reflex had kept me awake on midnight shifts for decades. The envelope felt heavier than it should. I folded my fingers over it as if it were a child. My palms were cool. I noticed a tremor in my thumb and tried to steady my breathing. In and out. Like we teach young mothers in the ward when they're about to push a birth into the world. "If I'm seen," I said, looking at Father Thomas, "what if Linda thinks I'm showing off? What if she thinks I want applause?" His expression changed, quick, then gone. "She loves you," he said simply. "But people misunderstand their love sometimes." The truth of that was a little arrow. The thought of Linda seeing my name in a framed calligraphy on the narthex wall made something in me clench. Not from shame, no, but from the worry that the gift would become a currency I hadn't meant it to be. I thought of the way Linda's voice had gone tight last week at the fitting, the way she'd fluttered her fingers and told me, almost apologetically, that I should take the last pew. A memory slid in. Edward at our kitchen table years ago, hand around a chipped mug, smiling with that tired, private sort of pride. "You don't need the altar to tell you you're kind," he'd said. "Do it because it matters. Let the world surprise you." The sacristy seemed to grow narrower, the air a fraction cooler. My heart beat loud, as if the small room could not contain it. There was a choice before me that was larger than this envelope. If I stepped into the light, I risked altering how my daughter, and perhaps the wider town, saw me. If I stayed hidden, the roof would be mended and the men would go home thinking the church had been saved by an anonymous neighbor. Either way, St. Mary's would stand. My fingers found the edge of the envelope and tightened. The paper creaked. For a moment the sound was the only thing I heard. "Promise me, Father," I said. "Promise me you won't tell." He hesitated. You could see the argument in his face. The parish's need for stewardship, the honesty of transparency. Then he nodded. "If this is your wish, Eleanor. If it will keep your heart quiet." It felt like stepping off a small ledge. Relief was a sudden warmth in my chest and guilt trailed right behind it like a shadow. I tucked the envelope deeper into the bag. The leather smelled faintly of lemon oil and cigarette smoke. It was Edward's laugh in material form. When I walked out into the nave, the scaffolding creaked like a tired ship. The sun through the stained glass poured colors along the aisle. I ran my thumb along the ring on my left hand until the metal warmed. I had made my choice. I had decided to be invisible so that what mattered, the place, the people, might stay. Only later did I understand how that choice would shift the shape of things. Sitting in the last pew at Linda's wedding, smiling with a mouth that hid salt, I would feel that moment in the sacristy like a hinge turning. But at the time, as I placed the envelope on the table and felt Father Thomas close the drawer, all I carried was the steady, small conviction that some gifts are meant to be quiet. The bishop's eyes found me like a hand on my shoulder. For a moment everything else blurred. The organ, the rustle of silk, the scuff of shoes against the aisle. I felt the chapel's new lights warm my face. The varnish on the pew beneath my palm smelled faintly of lemon and wood. My thumb found the inside of my wedding band. The sound that rose then wasn't one sound. It was a rustle, a dozen soft OS, the shuffle of programs. Linda's face. I have a photograph of it in my chest. Her mouth fell open. Her fingers pressed to her throat as if to hold her breath. She was 28, yes, but for a moment she looked like the little girl who learned to walk on the cracked linoleum of our kitchen. Her eyes found mine and I saw the first small fracture of recognition, like light through old glass. The bishop stood and came down the aisle. His robe whispered against the floor. When he reached me, he took my hand with surprising firmness. His palm was cool. His gaze was steady, not theatrical. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, and in the quiet of his voice I heard memory. "Come forward." My legs shook like leaves. I rose before the whole congregation watched, and for a second every step echoed. I felt something strange and dizzy, like being held in two places at once. The woman who had slipped money into an envelope in a sacristy, and now this woman whose name people were repeating under their breath. Linda met me halfway down the aisle. She wrapped her arms around me and the world narrowed to the warm, solid weight of her body. She smelled like lilies and perfume, and like 1,000 afternoons I'd braided her hair. "Mom," she said, and she was trembling. I didn't know. Please forgive me." Her fingers dug into my shoulders. There was no grand speech, only the small frantic sound of someone trying to find her footing. Her apology was a photograph too. The sleep-scattered hair, the freckle near her ear, the way her voice cracked and mended. I couldn't help the tears, warm trails down my face. "Oh, love," I whispered. My hands, those hands that had held sterile forearms steady in the ER, that had wiped fevered brows at night, moved to cup her cheek. "There's nothing to forgive." Across from us, Mrs. Miller's lips tightened. Her bracelets chimed when she lifted a hand to her throat. She'd been the one to suggest the last pew, to dress propriety in a way that made my solitude obvious. Now she watched as the church rearranged itself around me. Her face was a map of shifts, surprise, then calculation, then something like concession. When she stood later, after the ceremony, to offer a hand, it trembled just enough that I saw the person behind the polished exterior, bristled, defensive, then softened by the place itself. James was smaller than I'd thought when he came forward. He kept his hands clasped, fingers white at the knuckles. His voice was a child's when he managed a shaky, "Thank you, ma'am." He meant it to be to me. He meant it to be to the church. I could see the effort it took him to look his mother in the eye. The bishop asked me, quietly, why I had insisted on anonymity. His voice was gentle, the kind that had led him through battlefields in another life. He did not need my answer to praise me. He only wanted the truth laid plain. I felt the pearls at my throat cool as I breathed. The memory of Edward's laugh came like a warm draft. "Because some gifts," I said, and the words came slowly, "don't need applause. They need shelter." My voice was small but it held. They need to be done without asking a ledger for thanks. It was not an indictment of anyone. It was a shape of what love meant to me. Quiet, practical, like tucking a blanket around a sleeping child. The bishop nodded as if he understood more than the words. Around us people exhaled. The tension in the room didn't disappear, but it shifted, moved from a blade to something like softened clay. After I sat in the front row, the view was different. I could see the thread of Linda's veil against her cheek, the tremor in the groom's jaw when he said, "I do." I could hear the faint hum of the organ pipes I'd paid to tune. Every note landed, and for the first time that day I allowed myself to take in the sound as someone who had helped make it possible. Later, near the reception, Mrs. Miller found me. Her smile was hesitant, but there was something like apology in it. "Eleanor," she said, and the words were awkward in her mouth. "I didn't expect." She paused, and I watched her choose between pride and the more honest ache of being wrong. "Thank you," I said instead. It was not a triumphal line. It was a handing back of a moment of a lesson. She looked at me then with a woman's appraisal, and for a breath there was no glitter, only truth. That evening, when Linda hugged me again in a hush of streamers and laughter, I thought of all the small photographs, of Edward's sweater on the chair, of a hymn book edge worn thin, of my hand smoothing a child's hair at 2 in the morning. They were the proof of a life, not to be hung on a wall, but stitched quietly into other people's days. When people ask me now about that moment, about stepping forward under every gaze, I think of the way my ring felt heavy and honest. I think of the way Linda's hands fit in mine. I think of a roof held up by numbers and by love, and of how sometimes visibility is the gentlest teacher we can offer those we love. The first Sunday after the announcement, the coffee tasted like dishwater. I sat with my hands wrapped around a paper cup because it kept my fingers busy. The steam fogged my glasses for a moment and I watched the room through softened circles. People moved around the folding tables with plates balanced on napkins, but the easy, habitual greetings that had always been the church's small music were missing. Instead there were quick smiles that ended before they touched the eyes, conversations that stopped when I neared. As if the room were a radio and someone had turned down the channel. Mrs. Klein set a plate of scones down 2 feet away from me and then, without making real eye contact, stepped back and hovered with her hands folded like a hostage. "We're just so grateful," she said, and there was a tremor at the end of the sentence that didn't belong to gratitude. I thanked her and felt the words fall flat between us. It wasn't only at St. Mary's. The next morning at the grocer I felt the aisle narrow. Carts slowed. People slipped around me with the soft, calculated choreography of those who want to avoid causing a scene. A pair of teenagers on the school bus who used to wave now looked toward the window and pressed their faces to the glass, watching me like I was an exhibit. The post office clerk's voice was the same, but her hands moved faster, as if there were a job more important than the package I'd come for. Rumors are a kind of weather here. They arrive small and invisible, and then suddenly the whole town is damp. The story of my donation had been a blessing and then, in the measuring of afternoons and whispers, it had become a question. Why would a widow with a modest nest egg do such a thing? Some people answered with admiration, others with suspicion. I heard generous in one breath and showing off in the next. The words cut differently when you used to be the person who handed out casserole pans at funerals. There were subtle exclusions that came like paper cuts. The volunteer list for the hospital shuttle posted on the bulletin board one Tuesday and my name, always second after Father Thomas, was simply not there. The bake sale sign-up had a cluster of names, and then a blank space where mine usually Saturday. "We thought you might want a break," they said, and their smiles were too tight. "Just for now." I nodded. My throat tightened in a way that tasted of old stitches. Linda tried. She called between work and wedding planning and pushed words through the receiver with small jagged breaths. "Mom, some people, they don't understand, but I told them how important you were." She said it as if repetition might stitch the division in the air. I believed her. And yet at the next choir practice the director's nod across the aisle was careful, as if acknowledging me meant choosing a side. Martha Miller's absence from the front pew on a Tuesday made an impression like a dropped coin. She had always clung to the best seat like it was a crown. Now she sat further back, her jewelry quiet. She didn't greet me. Instead she gave me that polite, measured smile that indicates you are permitted to exist, so long as you remain contained. Once years ago, I had let such a look slide from me without much heed. Now I felt every inch of it. At the farmer's market, where neighbors normally traded recipes and tomatoes, people crossed the grass to avoid standing beside my table. Children who used to scramble up to get a kiss on way to soccer practice tugged their parents' sleeves, and were instructed to play on the other side. One mother said, "We're teaching them about humility," and I heard the phrase like a verdict. Father Thomas tried to hold the center. He invited me to speak at a weekday prayer meeting, a small gesture to anchor conversation back into something honest. I went because I wanted to hear the congregation's pulse, and because he had that look he gives people when he believes. The hardest part was watching the shape of Linda's life shift in the small spaces between us. She began to accept invitations I wasn't asked to be photographed at gatherings where my presence would have once been natural. She smiled when people said nice things to her, and looked away when they said anything about the benefactor. I could see her fitting herself into someone else's story with a concentration that made me ache. At night the house seems larger. The kettle's whistle in the kitchen has an echo I don't remember it having. Edward's sweater still sits on the chair, the scent of his tobacco faint and steady. I reach for my ring sometimes the way one fingers a talisman. It grounds me when the town's air feels sharp. I go to St. Mary's because that's where my life has been shaped. But I now move through the nave like someone wearing a coat 2 sizes too big, visible, and yet oddly separate. People close doors for a reason. Sometimes to keep out the cold. Sometimes to keep out what they do not wish to understand. I know I have altered the town's air. I did not mean to become a lesson. I only wanted the roof to hold when winter came. The hush that follows me these days has weight. It presses into the marrow in quiet ways. But each morning I make the same small choice, to stand to hold my place, and to let the light through the stained glass fall where it may. The bishop's shoes whisper on the aisle before I even look up. It's that sound, leather against polished wood, that makes the hair at the nape of my neck stand up. The organ is a low breath behind him, a held note that trembles in the rafters. I feel it through the soles of my shoes. The stained glass throws colored rectangles across the aisle like tabs of memory. My hands are folded in my lap, fingers threaded until the knuckles blanch, the ring warm and steady against my skin. He walks slowly. I know that walk. He carries a weight like someone who's carried hard things for a long time. He pauses by the sacristy door and then, without fuss, his eyes find mine. The contact is a small electric line. I don't know whether my heart beats or the world does. It trips like a patient startled awake. He leans toward Father Thomas. I see the bishop's lips move. A single phrase pass between 2 men who know the gravity of names. Father Thomas's face tightens, surprise first, then something like resolve. He steps away from the lectern and his hand lifts to the microphone. There's a small microphone pop, a soft crackle that stretches out like a question. For a second everything contracts to sound. The organ's held chord vibrates in my chest. The room smells of beeswax and the lemon polish they used on the pews. Someone 2 rows up coughs. A child rustles a paper program. I am aware of each tiny noise as if it's magnified. Father Thomas clears his throat, and the sound echoes. It must have been years since I heard my own breathing so loud. I breathe slow because I have to. I remind myself how nurses teach you to regulate. Inhale, count, exhale. My hands are still into themselves. The skin between my fingers has that dryness from winter, the small ridges of habit. I feel old Edward's sweater in my memory beside the chair at home, the smell of tobacco and lemon oil, and I almost reach for the comfort of it with my thumb. I do not. Before we continue, Father Thomas says into the microphone. His voice rides the current in the room and then the current stops. There is someone here we must recognize. 200 pairs of eyes slide like shutters. The hush that falls isn't soft. It's thick and cold. I can feel it settle on my shoulders like a coat I didn't put on. Linda freezes at the altar. The bouquet in her hands loses shape between her trembling fingers. James's jaw tightens. Martha Miller, poised like a little storm in her chair, tilts her head as if listening for an apology. My breath catches. I grip the ring and turn it once in a slow, secret motion. The metal bites the pad of my finger. I count to 3 under the breath as if counting stitches. 3. Father Thomas says my name. The syllables hang like a candle flame in a draft. Eleanor Thompson. They sound formal, as if he is reading from a ledger. I feel every head in the room move. I become aware of the varnish of the pew under my palm. It smells like cut wood, like the carpenter who once fixed the choir loft with careful hands. Those smells anchor me and make me human. There is a draft then, subtle and sudden. The votive candle near the altar shivers. The flame twittered as if in a hush, and then it guttered out with a soft sigh. The darkness where the flame had been holds itself for a beat too long. I hear the faint clatter of programs, the way hope rearranges itself when things shift. Father Thomas moves forward. In the reach for the microphone he brushes the little brass crucifix that sits at the edge of the lectern. A relic someone left long ago. It teeters on the rim and then falls, striking the wood with a tiny metallic knock that ricochets up the aisle like a dropped bell. The sound is small and absurd and suddenly cavernous. It's as if something in the room has shifted on its hinges. All of it, the bishop's look, the whisper, the microphone pop, the candle going out, the crucifix clattering, lands on me with a force that makes my knees remember gravity. For a moment I am a child again, and the church is the only steady thing I know. I feel the old nurse's calm try to press into place. My hands are still clasped. I breathe in and hold, like we hold a wound to see if the bleeding slows. Linda's face changes in an instant. The practiced composure that had become part of her wedding day posture cracks. Her mouth opens and closes, useless. Her shoulders shake with a sob she does not let out. She looks smaller, as if someone has measured her against the world and found her wanting. I can see her trying to parse which version of me she is seeing. Her mother at the stove, the woman who'd mended a broken toy, the stranger announced in a pulpit. Mrs. Miller's features rearrange beneath a polite smile. There's calculation and then, quickly, a slide towards something softer. I see the old landmarks in her face recede. Perhaps she had been anchoring herself to the idea of propriety so tightly she hadn't noticed the house of faith needed boards and heat. That realization makes a little fissure run across her expression, and it is as much a crack in her armor as any outburst could be. The congregation leans in. Breath held. Heads tilt. I feel the pressure as if someone has cupped their hands around a flame. My throat is dry. I force a measured exhale and let it go on purpose. Let them hold their breath. Let the moment be what it will. The bishop steps down the aisle. He comes toward me with that same steady bearing he used when he spoke to confessions during his visits to the hospital years ago. There's no sermon in his face now. Just a recognition that moves like sunlight across a table. Mrs. Thompson, he says, and the sound of my name from his mouth is not a ledger entry. It is an invitation. My legs are trembling. I stand because my body remembers how to obey the small decent instincts that have carried me through life. Stand when called, show up for what needs tending. As I rise, the room exhales in unison. The wood of the pew under my palms resists for a second and then gives. For the first time that day, I am visible in the full, uncomfortable light. The place I chose to shelter now holds me open, and the sound of all those held breaths loosens into something like a beginning. I felt the room tilt when the bishop said my name. For a breath I was all memory. The hymnals under my thumb, Edward's sweater on the chair, the ledger tucked under a loose floorboard. And then the present snapped in, bright and sharp as the polished aisle. Every eye was a small weight. My knees remembered being steady in an emergency room. My hands remembered how to be calm. I stood. Linda met me halfway. She was trembling like a bird. And for a second she looked less like the woman in lace and more like the little girl who once hid behind my skirts. Her arms folded around me with a pressure that said more than any sermon. "Mom," she whispered into my hair, voice raw. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." Her apology was a small, urgent thing. It didn't undo the weeks of silence or the way she'd stepped back from our life together. But in that hug she unmade something of the distance. I felt her forehead press into my shoulder. I smelled the lilies from her bouquet, and the faint perfume of a life that had been rearranged for other people. I held her the way nurses hold someone shivering through a fever. Steady, patient. The bishop's hand on my sleeve was light but firm. He was not theatrical. He moved as if he had come to right a small imbalance. Mrs. Miller Martha watched from her seat like someone seeing a map with a new road they hadn't expected. I could see her jaw working, the tiny catch in her throat when she realized the woman she'd relegated to the last pew had been keeping the house of God warm. Later, at the reception, she would find me by the punch table. She approached like someone stepping onto ice. "Eleanor," she said, and her voice was smaller than it had been when she told me where to sit. Her bracelets chimed, but softer now. I didn't." She stopped, searching for something beyond etiquette. Her hand hovered, then settled lightly on my arm. The gesture tentative, almost apologetic. I wanted a grand speech. I wanted to tell her exactly how it felt to be made invisible. But what changed her wasn't words. It was the image she carried now. The church repaired, the choir pipes tuned, Linda's veil lit by the very lights my money had bought. I let the moment be the lesson. "Thank you," I said simply. It wasn't triumph. It was a handing back. Her eyes sank for a second, and then she gave me the kind of honest, uneven smile people do when they are trying on humility for the first time. It was enough. James came forward, his hands still trembling. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed, and his voice was steady with a kind of boyish earnestness. He looked at his mother as if asking permission to be kinder than she had been. There was a softness in him that hadn't been visible under old expectations. The rest of the ceremony moved like a tide. Sitting in the first pew felt odd lighter, as if someone had taken a weight from my shoulders and set it on the floor. I watched Linda say her vows, and the organ swelled in a way that felt like gratitude. I let myself listen to the music I had helped keep sounding. The notes landed like small absolutions. At the reception, people came up to me in clusters. Some were awkward, finding words that didn't sound like lectures. Others were simply grateful, with wet eyes and hands that lingered. Father Thomas hugged me longer than he usually did, and I could feel his relief in the press of his shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said into my hair, and it sounded like a benediction. In the days that followed, the town's breath shifted again. Not entirely back to what it had been, but warmer. Some neighbors resumed their small courtesies. A few remained distant. That's the way people decide where they want to stand and what they are willing to change. Linda and I found our rhythm again, not the same as before. She had learned that social ease could carry quiet cruelties, but closer than it had been. Years later, when I sit in the sunlight at St. Mary's and look up at the new stained glass, there is a small inscription at the bottom, my name tucked into the lead like a private punctuation. It is discreet, the sort of acknowledgement I told Father Thomas I did not want. But the real change is not in the glass. It's in Linda. She speaks now from the pulpit sometimes, awkwardly at first, but with a steadiness that comes from facing small truths. She will call me afterwards, breathless and full of news, and I can hear the edges of her better judgment in her words. She chooses differently now, who she sits with at coffee hour, who she defends when someone's kindness is questioned. Her life has been rearranged by a small revelation into something that fits us both. I still wear my ring every day. Some mornings the weight of the town's whispers presses like cold through the walls, and some mornings the sun through the stained glass falls across my lap like a promise. I gave so a place might remain. In the end, the lesson I taught without wanting to was this: visibility can be a kindness too. To be seen sometimes teaches others how to see. The light in St. Mary's still comes like honey through the stained glass. Some mornings it pools on the aisle in a single stripe, and I sit until the sun moves it across the wood and warms my knees. The new panes glint there, and if I lean forward I can see my name tucked into the lead at the bottom, small, precise, as if someone had written it in pencil and then remembered to be kind. People ask if I minded the attention after the wedding. The truth is more complicated. At first it felt like someone had moved the furniture in my life without asking. But furniture can be moved and rooms can still be warm. Over time I learned to like the new arrangement. Linda comes often. She teaches a reading now sometimes, halting at first, and then with a steadiness that has come from having to look at herself in a new light. She'll take my hand at the entrance and press a question into my palm without words. We sit closer these days. There is a small practical tenderness in the way she pours the coffee after Mass, the way she tucks stray hair behind my ear like the child I used to braid. Father Thomas keeps the same slow, careful watch. He still folds his hands the way he did that afternoon in the sacristy when I tucked the envelope into my bag. He will joke about the brass plaque with a softness that admits he knows better than to tease the things that matter. The bishop visits sometimes, the same slow walk, the same measured greeting. He still calls me Mrs. Thompson, as if the title itself gives something steady to hold. Martha Miller passed me a casserole once at a funeral. Her bracelet chimed when she set the dish down. She didn't offer apologies. People rarely do in sentences, but she offered presents. It was small. It was enough. We learned to let small things fill the spaces big gestures had hollowed. The town shifted, not all at once but like water finding its new level. A few folks kept their distance. Others came forward, hesitant at first, then more honest. The volunteer board asked me back to drive the hospital shuttle. The bake sale list had my name again, and I signed up for the cookie table like I always had. Those things were quiet reparations. They were also ordinary proofs that life, in its stubborn way, keeps knitting itself together. There are Sundays when I still feel the hush of 200 eyes on my back. The memory arranges itself in the ribs, a bone-quiet reaction that was there the instant Father Thomas spoke my name. But it has untangled itself from shame. It sits now next to gratitude. I can hold both. I go to the back sometimes by habit. The third pew still carries the indentation of Edward's weight. I press my palm there and feel the varnish, the tiny nick where his pocket knife once caught the wood. Those marks remind me that some things are histories you carry, not weights you should try to lift off. I keep my ring on. I will for as long as my fingers remember the warmth of his hand. On Fridays the choir practices and the sound drifts through the open doors to the street. I stand on the threshold and breathe the notes in like a tonic. Old hymns, new harmonies. They are all stitched into the place now, the organ pipes tuned, the lights steady overhead. Sometimes a child will run past me on the steps, laughing, and I think of all the baptisms and weddings still to come. It makes my chest ache in a clean, simple way. A young couple stopped me on the path last spring. Their son had been baptized at St. Mary's the week before. We wanted to thank whoever fixed the roof, the mother said, cheeks pink from the wind. I smiled and watched her fold gratitude into the smallness of ordinary language. It felt less like a spotlight and more like a hand held out. I nodded and left it there. Not every thanks needs to be weighed. There are mornings I walk out with the coffee thermos in my bag, and the world seems particularly bright. The neighborhood smells of cut grass, of someone's grill, of laundry drying on the line. My steps echo differently now, less like the tentative shuffle of someone who is afraid of being too present, and more like the steady tread of a nurse who has learned to pace herself through long shifts. Sometimes I return to the sacristy door and touch the handle, like testing a memory to make sure it's still real. Father Thomas is usually there, sleeves rolled, hands flour-dusted from the parish potluck. We exchange small private jokes that have nothing to do with roofs or ledgers and everything to do with the odd comedy of being human. I have kept the habit of small anonymity in other ways. I still leave a loaf of bread on Mrs. Klein's porch sometimes, wrapped in brown paper. She always finds a way to say my name more kindly when she sees the loaf. Some things I prefer to do without a curtain call. But I no longer hide myself away as if my face were a secret that would spoil the work. At night the church stands like a dark silhouette against the sky. The lights inside are low. The new glass drinks the last of the sun and keeps it. I walk out after evening prayer, and the bell's note hangs for a long beat. I step onto the path, And sometimes Linda lingers at the doorway to kiss my cheek. We talk about nothing and everything. We speak differently now, with fewer assumptions, more patience. It is its own sort of altar. I walk away slowly. The sound of my shoes on stone fades. After a moment the wind catches the door and it clicks closed with a small decisive finality. A sound that is not an end so much as a beginning. The pew behind me is empty. The light lingers on the leaded glass, and I carry the day with me, quiet, mended and warm. The morning light still comes through St. Mary's like honey, warm, slow, forgiving. I find myself there more often than not out of duty, but because the paneled wood remembers me. The little nick where Edward's pocketknife snagged. The smooth place on the third pew where his weight once settled. I press my palm to that varnish and the memory feels like a small blessing against my skin. People ask if the revelation at Linda's wedding changed things. It did, in ways I expected and in ways that surprised me. The first Sundays after were brittle. Coffee cups clinked louder. Conversations smoothed over when I sat down. There were gaps where easy greetings used to be. I learned to sit with that because I also learned how quickly a town can reweave itself around a new truth. Some folks never returned to the easy warmth they'd once offered. A few faces stayed careful. But others came nearer, hesitant at first, then with a steadiness that mattered. Mrs. Klein brought scones again, eyes softer. The couple from down the lane called to thank whoever had fixed the roof. They left me a note and a jar of jam and I set it on my kitchen table like an offering. Martha Miller brought a casserole to a funeral once, her bracelets chiming against the lid. She did not apologize in words. She set the dish down and that was apology enough for the moment. Linda began to change in small stubborn ways that made me proud. She reads at Mass sometimes now, careful at first, voice catching, then finding rhythm. She sits closer to the people who need a hand. Once, after a weekday rehearsal, she slipped my hand in hers and without saying much, asked if I wanted more coffee. That small domestic grace felt like a reconciliation stitched through the ordinary. The bishop visits occasionally. He still calls me Mrs. Thompson, as if ceremony gives steadiness to a life. Father Thomas is a constant. He folds his hands the same way he did the day I tucked the envelope into my bag, and sometimes we stand in the sacristy and talk about nothing important, potluck logistics, the choir's new soprano, until the conversation becomes the way it always was, ordinary and precious. I keep my routines. I leave a loaf of bread on Mrs. Klein's porch sometimes, wrapped in brown paper. I volunteer to drive the hospital shuttle when my legs feel steady. There's a comfort to being quietly useful. But I no longer disappear into the back row by default. There are mornings I sit in the front pew and let the light catch my hair at the shoulder. It is an odd thing to be both seen and safe. People have asked me why I insisted on anonymity at first. The answer is simple and contained. Love doesn't always want an audience. I wanted St. Mary's to stand because a roof should not be the thing that tells whether a place deserves remembering. I wanted baptisms and funerals and Sunday jokes to have a home. Not to become an exhibit. But I also learned that sometimes being visible is its own kind of gift. When Linda looked at me that day, no longer as a shadow in the back but as someone who had kept the doors open, something in her shifted. She learned to value quiet labor in a different light. There were awkward moments. The town is made of stories that like to tip into gossip. I felt the weight of other people's questions when I handed over the envelope, the strain of being measured and found both generous and suspicious. That bruise lingered. It still stings when a volunteer list omits my name, or when a child who used to climb into my lap now looks past me. But there is also a tenderness now that appears unprompted. A neighbor holding the door so I can take my bag up 2 steps. A choir member saving me a program. Those small reparative gestures teach me as much as any public thanks. Sometimes I think of Edward in odd moments. The scent of his sweater in the chair. The way his laughter tucked into the room like a comfortable blanket. I wear my ring every day. It is my anchor. People assume it's a marker of sorrow. For me it's a promise. To keep steady, to be practical, to love without theatrics. The pearls at my throat still cool against my skin when the morning air comes through the open church doors. The new stained glass has my name tucked into the lead, discreet, unassuming. Father Thomas argued for it and I allowed it, more for the children who will one day look up and trace letters they've never read than for any satisfaction I might feel. Names can be small guides. But the real change lives in how Linda moves through a room, in the way Mrs. Miller glanced and then softened, in the quiet that finally unauded into conversation. What surprised me most was how the act of stepping into the light taught other people how to see. Not everyone changed. Not every heart softened. But enough did that St. Mary's feels like home again, warmed, not by a single beam of recognition, but by a slow folding back together of ordinary lives. If I learned anything from that day, it is this. Generosity is often private, but truth is not. Letting the world know the truth of what we are capable of, gentle, stubborn, unadorned, teaches the ones we love how to look a little kinder. I still go to the sacristy sometimes and set my hand on the worn ledger, the one Edward used to joke about. I smile to myself and breathe in. The bell chimes noon and the sound settles into my bones like something steady. I walk out onto the steps and the sun paints the stone a deep gold. Linda waits at the doorway and kisses my cheek. Some secrets are small and tender. Some are the kind that, when finally told, teach more than 1,000 sermons. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.